Afternoon stampers. Once again, I'm going to try to have a small tutorial on how we made this card for class using the new Bloom with Hope stamp set, which is a hostess set from Stampin' Up, using new in color paper, which is the Lost Lagoon, and the designer paper pack from All A Bloom, which this is the piece that is the Lost Lagoon. For today's tutorial, I'm going to be using another piece from that same paper stack. So this is the card, and this is actually watercolored, and I'm just going to show you how I did this quick centerpiece here, and I'll pause the tutorial to give the paper time to dry. We'll come back and we'll finish with the embellishing. So what I have is a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 piece of the watercolor paper. And I put it on my scoring tool, and I scored at 3/4 on all sides. And then I went back and scored just inside of that a 1/4 inch all the way around. That's where I'm going to paint my background. If you score it, it'll have a tendency not to run all over the place when you're watercoloring. And you don't have to have pencil lines. Pencil lines sometimes can be hard to get rid of once you've put Stampin' Up! Ink over them. And I'm going to be using Lost Lagoon and some daffodil to have this nice little watercolor effect with the little swatches of yellow behind it. I kind of got a little bit too much yellow there, but that's good enough. And then we'll go back and we'll color in the flowers with our markers. So once you get your paper scored, then you're going to stamp it with Stays On ink. It has to be Stays On or it will run all over the place. And I used one of these stamps from the new hostess set, Bloom with Hope. This is the one I used. Okay, so what I'm going to do first is I have a little cup of water here. And I'm just going to, these are regular watercolor brushes. And I'm just going to put water on my brush. I'm just using a square brush because I can do it quicker and easier that way. And I'm just going to wet my whole little rectangle here. Kind of stay away from the flowers tips because I want them to stay kind of white. But I want to get water on my paper. And just get that up to that little scored edge. Now you could mask it off with masking tape, but I kind of like the way that it shows that it is actually watercolored and not just painted in. You know, that'd be more like a coloring book. And I want it to have the watercolor look to it. And just kind of go up to the edges of those flowers. I'm going to try not to get too much water on there. Okay, so that's my water. I'm going to use a different kind of watercoloring brush. And instead of using ink pads or pens today, since I have to put so much ink on there, I'm going to just put a drop of the Lost Lagoon on my acrylic block right here. And I'm going to dip my brush, and just wipe it on the edge of my jar, pick up this ink, and I'm just going to start laying it in. And I want the bottom of the picture to be darker than the top, so I'm going to start down there, just like that. And you see it running, going crazy, which is what you want it to do. And I'm just going to pull that down and just kind of stay away from the flowers themselves, you know, and just work it in. I want the top part up here to be the lightest part. Pick up a little more color. Try not to go back and touch the areas that you just did or you'll get blooms. That's a watercoloring term for a water splotch. But if you'll just kind of do it one time, don't overwork it. That's the effect we're going for right there. And I'm actually going to hold the paper up so that I'll make sure that all the darkness runs to the bottom, any excess. Just like that. Don't take your paper and start fanning it, because if you do that, you could sling paint outside your little rectangle that you've made here. Okay. Now, before I do the yellow, I want it to dry just a little bit. So, through the magic of video, we're going to just pause and come back. Okay, now that my Lost Lagoon is dry to the touch, I'm going to put some yellow in there. And I just want to kind of have the yellow across the bottom like these might be flowers in a field. So I wet my watercolor brush again, and I've got some daffodil here. I'm just going to pick up some of that, and I'm just going to put little dots kind of in a random pattern. There is a card online by I think it's somebody that actually is part of the Split Coast Stampers team or whatever, who has a card similar to this. She didn't give any instructions on how she did it, but I'm just assuming this is kind of what she did. So I'm just going to pick up the yellow and just make some blotches around as the water runs out the tip of my brush, because this is a watercolor brush. It's designed for this. Of course, it's not designed to work with ink instead of paint, but I just want something like that to give it the little effect that it might be out in a field. Okay, I'm going to rinse this brush and put this away. Okay, so there's my little background done. Now while that's drying, I'm going to take my daffodil marker, and I'm going to use the brush tip, and I'm just going to color in the flower from the top down. And this is watercolor paper, so it's not like using blendabilities on white paper. It's not going to work that way. I'm just going to lay the yellow in. Then I'm going to take some Calypso Coral using the brush tip, and these little lines that are just naturally in the stamp set, these little what would be shadow lines, I guess. And I'm just going to kind of use my pen to squiggle those in. You don't really want to overwork this. It just takes a little bit, you know. Less is more in this case. Then I'm going to take my aqua painter and just kind of wet it a little bit, and those colors will bleed together, which is what I'm looking for. Just kind of give it that watercolory look, light, airy. Okay, then I'm going to use Wild Wasabi just because it shows up really good on this background. And underneath here where those stems kind of start, and then I'm just going to go up with the stem. If your paper's really wet from doing the yellow blotches, you might want to wait till it's dry before you do your stems. You don't want it bleeding all over the place. Just like that. And just add a little bit of green to the bottom. That's all I'm going to do. When it's completely dry, I might go back and use my Uniball pen and just make a few, white highlights on the leaves, but it's really not necessary. Or you could put some little white dots on top of this yellow part to kind of look like the field of flowers. Okay, I'm going to let that dry for just a few minutes, and while it's drying, I'll go ahead and mount my paper. This is from the paper stack, the little pads that are 4.5 by 6.5. I'm going to go ahead and mount this piece. The back is real pretty too, you can see. It's really a great paper pack. It's got some really nice colors in it. And I'm just going to go ahead and mount these two together. My paper, of course, my mat is cut at 4 by 5 1/4, and this piece is cut 3 1/4 by 5. Okay, so now that's ready to mount to the front of my card. And I have my card base is Lost Lagoon. And I'm going to use my new fast fuse tape because it really adheres well. It's just, I'm getting better and better at it, using it, flicking, which you have to kind of lay it down and then make a little check mark when you get to the end. You can't pick it up. I'll go ahead and put that on the front of my card. Okay, so there are my cards ready for my artwork. Okay, I have a piece of twine. I have a little button. I used the little wooden button here, but I'm just going to use another kind that I found in my drawer. Okay, our artwork's still drying. I'm going to make this one a birthday card. So I'm going to show you how to tear off these edges. But when you tear it off, save your little scrap because we're going to use that to stamp our sentiment on. And I'm stamping this in Lost Lagoon. And Stampin' Up is watching. Please bring back the stamping spots. And I'm just going to stamp that on there. And we'll punch that out with our word window punch. Okay, so this is pretty dry. And these outer 3/4 inch places that I scored before, I'm just going to fold them back and forth. Like that, just get it back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. You can you can also kind of run your razor blade down it if you want to, just to kind of get it, the fibers really broken. And then we're just going to tear it on that line. If you just hold your finger like right here, or your fingernail right here at the edge, you can tear. We want it to be kind of rough. I don't want it to be that rough. I'll pull that off. Okay, so fold back and forth and tear that off. And that's a little rough too, so I'm just going to trim that off. You know, watercolor paper, when it's wet, it's actually stronger than it is when it's dry. So it might be a little harder to tear. It's a little too rough to suit me. Might not be too rough to suit you. You can do this. This helps too. Run your scissor down the line. It's like using the razor blade. And that'll make it tear a little bit smoother if you don't want it too raggedy. Well, that's good. Okay. So this is, you'll save these little scraps. This will be what you stamp your sentiment on. And this looks pretty good. Like that. Get that little bit of fuzz off there. A little bit too fuzzy. Okay. Now, to give it a little bit of what I call texture, we're going to use our sponges and we're going to sponge the edge. Usually when I sponge, I use an old Stampin' Up! Color called Close to Cocoa, just because it's not too drabby, but it gives it a nice antique-y color. I'm just going to lightly sponge that around the edge. Remember, less is more once again. You don't want it to look dirty. Okay, so that's good enough for that. You can, if you want to, you can sponge around the edge of this piece of designer paper with some Lost Lagoon if you kind of want to give it a little bit more depth. But this is going to get mounted to the front right here. But first we want to put our twine in our little piece of lace and our button. So I've got the twine, it's about 1 yard, folded in half, and I'm just going to hold it right here in the front. Give myself enough to tie, wrap it around. Oh, just perfect. So now here's my 2 little ends. And what I'm going to do is run one of them underneath the other piece. Like that. Okay, don't pull too tight. Don't want to make too big a dent in the side of your paper. And I'm going to go ahead and tie it like that just once. And then I'm going to put my little piece of lace in. And I'm going to tie a knot. Or I'll tie it again on top of that because I got it tied underneath the ribbon. Now I'm going to tie on top of the ribbon. Or lace, which we'll call it ribbon or lace. Okay, and see I pulled it a little too tight. Undo that a little bit. Don't want to dent my sides too much. Pull that a little looser. There we go. And you want to kind of separate those edges like that. Okay. When you get it just right, tighten it just a little bit. Okay, now I'm going to do the magic spit trick and put my button on by threading this through. It's a lovely thing. My mother would have a fit. And my mother-in-law, she couldn't stand to see anybody lick the thread to thread a needle. She was a quilter and, oh Lord, that was just forbidden. I think my mother didn't like it just because she thought it was germy, but I know my mother-in-law didn't like it because she said, oh, you get lipstick on your thread, or you'll get, she obviously didn't know crafters don't really wear makeup when they're crafting. Okay, so that's kind of spread out, and I'll wrap that under. I'm going to tie a knot. trim off those ends. Okay, and I'm going to use one of my little handy dandy glue dots that I got from another kit that I really like these. I don't know if it's something new Stampin' Up's going to have, but I've kind of going to attach to them now. So they come on this little sheet. They're a little bit bigger, and because they're on these little squares like this that just peel off, you can take the little square and put it where you want it to be, like that. This is like using my friend Gloria's trick. She does this a lot. And sticks them on there and then sticks it down. There we go. Okay. And I'm going to trim that off a little bit. Don't want that overpowering this beautiful artwork we've gone to the trouble to make. Okay, and that's going to be mounted there. And I'm going to mount it with dimensionals just so that it sets it off a bit. And because this is watercolor paper, it's kind of heavy. You will need more than just 2. You need to put 5 or 6 on there. I'm going to put that many. And that'll just be mounted in the center. Now you could be, you know, if you're one of those abstract people, you know, you could stick it on crooked. I have some people in my class that are like very, we can't tilt it. That just would look weird. And Mary Sutton knows I'm talking about her. So we'll just mount it right in the middle. Okay, just like that. And my little sentiment that I stamped the happy birthday on. I have a friend with a birthday coming up. This will be perfect. And I have some little strips of the Lost Lagoon. Just the glue pen, because this word window is not very big. It's gotta have a little small ballpoint or something like that. And I'm just going to come away from the edge about that far. Oops. Okay. And I'm just going to leave that. I might round it a little bit. Now on this end, I'm just going to trim it and make a little fishtail. Okay, and then once again, use one of my handy dandy little glue dot friends and put that on the back. Okay, and I'm just going to stick that up under here. Alrighty. Bows tend to go swampy jawed whenever you're making a video upside down, because I tie things backwards when I'm doing it upside down. Okay, and that's our finished card. I'm probably going to go and add a few rhinestones that I've colored with the new Blendability's Daffodil Marker, which hopefully will be available to the general public in about another month. And put those down here or maybe up the side. But it makes a very elegant card. It's watercoloring, easy peasy. Don't be afraid to watercolor. It's not that hard. It's not supposed to be perfect. Happy stamping!